The 9 Stages of Ego Development, Part 2. So we're continuing on here with our 3-part series on cognitive development. And yes, there's going to be a Part 3 because I looked over all the content that I want to cover in the later stages, and there's just so much more to say, so much more value to extract from the later stages, because after all, that's what we're focused on. So it's going to be worth your time to stick around for Part 3 as well. In fact, the most exciting part of our work, the most important part of our work will be in Part 3. But in Part 2, you're also going to get a lot of value here. So don't think that this is some sort of weak sauce episode. This is powerful stuff. This episode alone can change your whole understanding of mankind and your own development in relationship to it. So I'm really excited here to get into this material, for which I should credit, once again, Susanne Cook-Greuter, because she's done some amazing, brilliant work articulating these different stages. Her articulation, her wording is just superb. Go download her free research paper. It's 90 pages long. I recommend you print it out, read it, highlight it, study it, in addition to listening me talk about it. You see, this material that we're covering here is so deep and so profound and so potentially life-transforming that it's not that you just watch one of these episodes or even the whole series and then you say, okay, yeah, I got it, Leo, and then you just go about your everyday life. It's like, no, you study this over and over and over again. You're going to have to watch these episodes 3-5 times in order to fully get all the juice that's here. And you have to watch them again throughout the rest of your life as well, because there's just so much stuff here. So anyways, let's get into it. A very quick recap of the stages we've already covered. We've covered the symbiotic, the impulsive, the opportunist, the conformist, the expert, and the achiever, all in Part 1. We've covered that. That's most of the people on this planet. The vast majority, probably 80+%. And then, now we're going to be talking about the post-conventional stages. And I'll explain what post-conventional means here in a few minutes. So hang in there if you don't quite know what that jargon means. But the post-conventional stages are roughly 15 to 20% of the U.S. adult of the U.S. adult population. But globally, it's going to be a lot less than that. So if you're looking at third world countries, underdeveloped countries, it's going to be way lower than 20%. So here in the post-conventional category, we have the pluralist stage, which is roughly 11%, we'll be discussing today. And then we also have the autonomous/strategist stage, which comes after that, at roughly 5% of the U.S. adult population. And we'll be discussing both of those today. And then next time in Part 3, we'll be concluding with the construct-aware and the unitive stage, which are very rare, and but also the most important, really, to our work here. So a few general points about this model. Remember, it's a scientific model, or at least it claims to be so. What that means is that every scientific model has its limits. Sometimes I see people taking models like spiral dynamics or this ego development model, trying to apply it to animals or characters within movies. Like, you have to understand that that's not what these models are designed to handle. You can try to stretch it, but also beware of trying to go stretching it too far, and then it goes into some ridiculous, absurd category where you're trying to, fit something into some place where it doesn't really belong to fit. Another general point is that, remember that each stage here has the capabilities of the earlier stages underneath it. Sometimes people get the idea that you completely outgrow a stage and you leave it behind and you never tap into its capabilities ever again. Like, I used to be a conformist, and then I became an achiever. Or I was an achiever, and then I outgrew that, and I stopped achieving. No, that's not how it works. It works more like grades in school. Each grade builds on top of the next grade. 5th grade incorporates the information you learned in 1st grade and 2nd grade and 3rd grade. You're still able to read. You're still able to do math. You're still able to reason. You still understand history. It's just you understand it in a more nuanced, more sophisticated, more advanced form. And oftentimes when you understand it in a crude form, you make mistakes, you fall into various traps, you swing your pendulum too much into one direction or some other extreme, and you get into unhealthy territory. But usually as you explore a stage, fully embody it, learn it, experience it, master it over a period of 5 or 10 years, you become familiar with it, and then you exhaust it. And once you exhaust it, then you begin to move into the next higher stage. But just because you sort of exhausted it doesn't mean that you don't ever tap into those capabilities. You still do. Like, even advanced stages can still conform in a group environment. In fact, it would be dysfunctional if you didn't know how to conform. But there are healthy and unhealthy ways of conforming. And so also it's important to note that none of these stages are good or bad. You have to be very careful about falling into this trap of thinking that, well, a lower stage is evil, or it's toxic, or it's bad. No. Most of these stages are necessary. They're a necessary part of human development, just like being a child or being a teenager isn't inherently good or bad. In fact, it's necessary. You can't blame a child for going through puberty. It's necessary if you want them to become a healthy adult. But there are more and less healthy ways of going about it. So really our job here is to point out the traps and many of the unhealthy ways and to try to encourage healthy development at every stage. And every stage has its usefulness and its purpose. Remember, again, depending on how you're fitting in with your environment. So it's all about the fit between the organism and its environment. In many parts of the world, the environment is such that very advanced stages, even if they could exist, like you could maybe fly someone from an advanced country into a primitive country, he couldn't really thrive or survive in that primitive country because his mindset is too advanced for that kind of environment, right? You can take a yogi and throw him into a war zone, and he's not going to fare too well. Another general point is that what's so amazing about these different stages, remember, like you're sort of, each stage is its own reality, but the higher stages are a higher reality that incorporates the lower reality. So the higher stage can understand the lower stages because it went through them and it has more experience of them, and because it's able to take a higher perspective. Remember, moving up stages basically gives you more perspective. So with a higher perspective, you can see the lower perspectives. Sometimes it's challenging. Like it can actually be challenging for a high-level person to see and fully understand what it's like to be a low-level person, but generally they can do it. But what tends not to work is that the lower stages cannot fathom the higher stages. And in fact, usually there's a whole host of defense mechanisms that the lower stages use in order to deny that the higher stages even exist. Because of course, even to admit that there are stages and that you're at the lower end of the spectrum rather than the higher end of the spectrum, for many low-level people, this itself, in and of itself, is already a problem because it's extremely threatening to their ego, because it says, well, hey, you mean I'm not the best? I'm not as good as I thought I was? Yeah, that's basically what I'm telling you. That's the bad news. The good news, of course, you can become a lot better. But the bad news is that to become a lot better, you have to first admit that you're not as good as you think you are. And again, remember, lower stage people will have this kind of defense mechanism and say, oh, Leo, so you're saying I'm bad? No, I'm not saying you're bad. I'm just saying that the development of your mind is not as advanced, not nearly as advanced as it could be, as some of the highest, most developed humans that have ever lived. So this is just a radical, amazing possibility that's being presented to you with this model at the higher stages. See, you have to be humble enough to admit when there's something above your understanding. That can be very difficult. So even though you might hear the higher stages, one of two things will happen. Usually you're going to deny that these are even possible, or that they're real, or that they're beneficial anyway. Oftentimes you'll just dismiss it as woo-woo, or as nonsense, or as just fluffy, airy, impractical stuff, or it's just philosophy or whatever. So those are common defense mechanisms. Another common defense mechanism is that you will, the information will just go in one ear and out the other ear, and it like won't even register in your mind, because to really understand the higher stages, you have to develop through the lower stages first. It's sort of like a first grader is not going to understand 12th grade mathematics. It won't compute. You have to have a certain foundation established to be able to enter a 12th grade, calculus class or something, and to understand what's being talked about. To a first grader, a calculus class might seem like gobbledygook, and like woo-woo nonsense. What are all those scribbles on the chalkboard? It means nothing. You guys are insane doing all this scribbling. Yeah, that's what it looks like to a person who has no foundation in mathematics. So it can just be aware that it can seem that way, analogously, it can seem that way about the higher stages that we're going to be talking about. They can seem kind of outlandish and they could not make sense. That just means you haven't gotten to them yet. Try to keep your mind open. Also, a common misconception is that people tend to think that, well, if it's a higher stage, that means it's perfect. And a person at a higher stage needs to be like a saint. Not necessarily. There are dysfunctions even at the higher stages. You're not immune from dysfunction or pathology or self-deception at any stage, although it does tend to improve as you go higher. So there's some correlation, but it's not a perfect correlation. So this sort of simplistic idea of like, oh, well, that person did something that I think is morally wrong, therefore he can't be as high as some stage X. No, it just means that maybe he is at stage X. Maybe he is very advanced, but sometimes he makes mistakes. Sometimes he fools himself. Sometimes he has a false belief here or there. Sometimes he does something immoral according to your standards. See, again, it's your standards that we're talking about here. Also keep in mind that you do tend to regress stages when you are threatened or stressed. So that's important to understand. Also understand that awakenings and mystical experiences are possible at any stage. So mysticism is not just exclusive to the highest stages. It can happen at any stage. But what's important to understand is that when it happens at the lower stages, it's going to get interpreted through that low level of cognitive development. The mind is going to be rather crude. And so, like when a fundamentalist Christian has a legitimate mystical experience, he can misinterpret it, or just, I guess there's no misinterpreting here. It's just he will interpret it in a way which is going to be very sort of Christian, very fundamentalist, very medieval, and very exclusive. So it's going to be like, yeah, I experienced Jesus. Jesus came to me, delivered a vision to me, and that just demonstrates to me that my religion is the only true one, and all of you other guys, you Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus, you're all devils. And of course, there's some truth to that. There's still a legitimacy to that mystical experience, but the mind, because it's so simplistic, it's interpreting in a sort of black and white moralistic way that a conformist would. So really, what we want here is we don't want just mystical experiences and awakenings. We want them, of course, but we want them at the highest levels of cognitive development. That's where things get really, really good. And then there's less dysfunction. So there's more likelihood of dysfunction and devilry and unhealthy behaviors at the lower stages of spirituality than at the higher stages of spirituality. Because remember, spirituality occurs at all these different stages in different ways. All right, so let's talk about the post-conventional. So what is post-conventional as that category, as that label? What does that mean? It's the beginning of deconstruction. So up to this point, basically the ego was busy constructing itself as the conformist and as the achiever and as the expert. There was all this construction going on by the mind. The mind was, in a sense, constructing reality and wasn't aware of how it was constructing reality. And it was so busy constructing reality for its own survival purposes, trying to be an expert, trying to earn money, trying to put on a show for people, trying to be a good boy or girl to conform to your society, in your family, and so on. So you're so busy doing this that the mind, it never even occurs to the mind that a deconstruction process might be beneficial to it. So there's sort of like this arc that happens in this 9 stages of development. You start off the first half of the arc, which we already covered in part 1, all of those stages. That part of the arc is the ego developing itself, constructing itself. And then you sort of reach the apex of that construction process right at post-conventional, the pluralist stage, as we're going to start talking about here in a minute. And at that pluralist stage, that's when the mind becomes open to the possibility of deconstruction. What do we mean by deconstruction? Well, it means turning your focus inwards into your own psyche and mind, starting to analyze it and starting to really question yourself, starting to reflect about your beliefs, your ideas, and starting to realize the socially constructed nature of reality. So a lot of the stuff that previously the mind would consider as objective, as material, as real, as scientific, as absolute, like the Word of God or the Holy Bible. The Holy Bible is considered the absolute, and you don't question it. Now you start to question it. Now you start to deconstruct it. But not just the Bible. You also start to deconstruct rationality, logic, science, government, politics, maybe the capitalist economic system under which you were raised, or if you were raised under a socialist one, then you maybe start to deconstruct that one. You basically start to deconstruct all aspects of your culture. You start to question it, and you start to ask yourself, well, is this really true for all people everywhere? Or is it just something local and sort of rather arbitrary to my little culture, my little subgroup, my family unit, my corporation, my religion, or something like that? So relativity is a huge theme of the post-conventional stage. Relativity becomes acknowledged, whereas before it wasn't. For the mind to be able to think relativistically, this is a huge leap in cognitive advancement. And there isn't just a sort of an on-off switch of like relativity or no relativity. Rather, there's many degrees of relativistic thinking. And usually people are capable of some degree of relativistic thinking, but it's very minor. And so as you move through the post-conventional stages, it really ramps up. You become much more relativistic in your worldview, and then it gets really radical at the later stages, the very last few stages that we'll be talking about next time in part 3. So there's a realization at the post-conventional level that the meaning of things depends on one's relative position in regards to them, on one's personal perspective and interpretation of them. There is deep self-reflection that is beginning to happen. Awareness of one's own unexamined beliefs becomes almost painfully brought into one's consciousness. You have to wrestle basically with old beliefs that you've been programmed with in childhood and by your religion, by your culture, by science and all this in school, in university. Now you start to examine these beliefs more critically rather than just accepting them as a given or taking them for granted. The mind also opens up at this level to something beyond rationality. New epistemic modes, new ways of knowing the world than just logic, which was very popular in the expert and achiever stages, which were the conventional stages. Conventional is very logical, and then post-conventional is sort of post-rational, which often gets confused with pre-rational, sort of the pre-rational, post-rational fallacy, conflating that distinction. Noticing of illusion and self-deception begins at this stage. All problems become a matter of perspective and the mind. So the problems aren't necessarily out there in the world. Maybe it's more about how I think and relate to the world. There's an ever-decreasing defensiveness and less blaming of others as we move up these stages, and a lot of this defensiveness falls away in the post-conventional stages. Language starts to be questioned, and it becomes complex. So the previous stages basically took language for granted, whereas now language, because it's sort of the medium through which the mind thinks and understands things, that medium itself becomes transparent to it's starting to become transparent to itself, and it's starting to observe itself, and language is kind of doing the sort of self-reflective looking in on itself and questioning itself and languaging about languaging. So it kind of becomes meta. And the language becomes meta. Materialist assumptions are starting to be questioned, although not completely, but they're starting to be. The full illusion of materialism is not broken until even beyond the post-conventional. For that, you really need to get to the transcendent and to the unitive, which we'll be talking about in part 3. Although objects are seen as permanent, their meaning is seen as context dependent. So remember, we said that the ego is a meaning-creating machine. And so in the past, the ego was creating meaning. That's what we mean sort of by that first half of the arc, the construction of the mind. It's constructing the world and its meaning of the world, and while denying that it's doing so. And then when the deconstruction process starts, that meaning, you start to think about, wait a minute, was that meaning baked into the objects and the situations, or am I projecting that meaning out into the world because I have this ego that has certain needs and has certain biases, and therefore it's projecting those biases on the world, and that's skewing what it's seeing out there. And sure enough, that's exactly the case, of course. And you discover ever deeper layers of that. The boundaries of concepts are seen to be much more flexible in the post-conventional stage. So what does this mean? Well, concepts were before, like a concept like science. In the conventional stages, science is just sort of thought of as a static thing. Like, well, yeah, science. We know what science is. We just take it for granted that science is just this static thing. It's done a certain way. People have been doing it. You're either doing science or you're not doing science. It's either science or pseudoscience, or it's science or it's religion. And there's no blurring of that boundary. But then at the post-conventional, you realize, wait a minute, science. What is science? What defines the boundaries of science? Maybe science is not a static thing. Maybe science evolves, it morphs, it changes. Maybe the boundary between science and religion is not nearly as sharp as we thought. Maybe there's a lot of similarities between science and religion as an epistemic mode. How do we tell the difference between science and pseudoscience? See, and now the science concepts start to sort of break down because the boundaries become flexible. Now, of course, people at the conventional stages, they get freaked out by this. They think that this is a problem because oh, Leo, well, this means that we're not being scientific anymore. And we're going to devolve into some sort of religious fundamentalism again. No, it actually means that we're going beyond. See, science took us beyond religious fundamentalism, but now we're trying to discover something beyond science. And sure enough, there is such a thing, but you have to open your mind to it, and you have to start to work with these different flexible boundaries. But a lot of people just aren't open to this. They perceive what I'm saying now as some sort of, Trojan horse, cult way of skirting the rigors of science so that I can sneak in my own cult, new age, spiritual philosophy. And then this is sort of like my new religion that Leo's trying to push on people by talking about how science is flexible. No, that's to misunderstand. That's to be stuck at the conventional stages. So anyways, another thing that happens at the post-conventional is that the mind can look and compare whole systems of thought and organizations with increasing distance. So you're able to step outside of your whole thinking system and to look at the world from different thinking systems. There's an increased interest in uncovering hidden assumptions about oneself and one's society. At the conventional stages, there's just, you feel this, there's just a lack of interest. People, if you have conventional stage friends or coworkers or family members, you maybe bring some spiritual ideas to them, or you talk about some epistemic notions that start to question materialism, or start to question capitalism, or start to question, gender norms or whatever. And to them, thinking about these hidden assumptions of science, for example, this is they don't understand why this would be valuable. They think it's nonsense. They have all sorts of defense mechanisms, and ultimately they just don't care. They don't care to question any hidden assumptions. And therefore, their experience of life doesn't go very deep. They can't really understand life very deeply because most of life is hidden with these assumptions that you've been taking for granted your whole life, that you have to start to self-reflect about it and to start to deconstruct. The post-conventional is now able to look back at previous belief systems as systems, seeing them as systems. So Christianity, you can step back from it and say, that's a belief system. Islam, that's a belief system. Buddhism, that's a belief system. There's different kinds of Buddhism, different kinds of sub-belief systems within Buddhism. See? And so therefore, of course, my own belief system, whatever, maybe I was a Buddhist or a Christian, that also is a belief system. You're sort of stepping outside of yourself and you're able to sort of objectively evaluate yourself without being stuck in that system. That's the crucial capacity here that the mind is bringing online with the post-conventional, is that ability to step outside of one's paradigm or one's worldview. Although there's a lot to that, and it's not so easy, and it's not perfect here. Don't think that even though I'm describing these things, that some post-conventional person is going to be perfect at doing all of this. No, they're still going to make mistakes and fall into delusions and traps and illusions. So, this breaking, this whole quest of breaking out of illusion, this is a very deep quest. And there's many degrees of it. So just because you've broken out of a few illusions doesn't mean you're completely 100% free of illusions. Usually that's not the case. And there's now an appreciation of the existential, metaphysical, psychological, and epistemic issues and questions, which at the conventional and lower stages simply didn't register, did not compute. People didn't care about them at those stages. And that's why when you talk about my material, the stuff that I talk about with most people, with normies, normies are basically conventional-minded people. They see no value. They don't appreciate any existential sort of self-development work. They don't appreciate any metaphysical questions. They think it's nonsense. They think it's a waste of time. They think it's impractical. They would rather be out there earning money or having sex or buying a house or snorting drugs or driving a fast car. But if you do care about these metaphysical, existential, psychological, epistemic issues, then that's a good indicator that you're at the post-conventional or at least moving into it. All right, so now let's talk about the first post-conventional stage, which is the pluralist, about 11% of the US adult population. So at this stage, there's a realization that things are not what they seemed to be at earlier stages, because the interpretation of reality always depends on the position of the observer. So this is basically relativity. By the way, if you want to go really deep on relativity, check out my episode called Understanding Relativism Part 1, and I still need to release a Part 2, but we go deep there. Relativity is hugely important, perhaps one of the most important things I talk about, and also one of the most misunderstood things that I talk about is relativity. So the pluralist realizes that there are multiple perspectives, and exploring these perspectives now becomes fascinating. Whereas in the previous stages, one entrenched oneself into one perspective, like you just become a Christian and you want to be more and more of a Christian, to hell with all other perspectives because they're evil and wrong. Here now the pluralist realizes, wait a minute, there's all these different perspectives, all these different cultures to explore, all these different worldviews. This is very fascinating. I'm not sure anymore which is true. I can't be as absolutist and certain as I was when I was a conformist. And so now I have to go and explore. And there's so much to explore. So your mind opens up to reading new books and experiencing new cultures, trying new things and looking at the world in different ways. And that process in of itself is rewarding. It gives you sort of a thrill to do that. Your mind feels like the straitjacket has been taken off. There's a realization that observation influences what is observed, so objective judgment becomes impossible. So this is actually very much like they talk about the observation problems within quantum mechanics. And actually quantum mechanics is sort of a postmodern model and a postmodern way of looking at the world. And in fact, in a sense, we could say postmodernism was really ushered in with Einstein's general relativity and then quantum mechanics, which came shortly after it. And the two key philosophical and epistemic deep lessons of sort of the general relativity and quantum revolutions in worldview is that we moved away from the sort of strict, static Newtonian worldview where time and space and matter were seen as just these fixed, given external material things, and we can just take them for granted as true. Now with general relativity and with quantum mechanics, Einstein and Niels Bohr and others started to question, is there even such a thing as reality? Is there such a thing as time? Is there such a thing as space? Is there such a thing as matter and energy? And does it even make sense to say that we are observing an atom or that we are measuring energy in some objective sense when we are doing science? As it turns out, no, you can't do that, because there's that entanglement, that quantum entanglement problem, which basically says that when you're measuring some sort of tiny subatomic particle or a quark or whatever, the problem becomes that the very mechanism that you're using to probe the particle itself is entangled with the result that that particle gives back to you. So when you probe that particle one way, it's a particle. When you probe it another way, it's actually a wave. It's not a particle. So is there even such a thing as a particle? Well, no, because the notion of particle is already relativistic. By saying there is a particle, that already implies some way in which you're probing that thing that's there. But then the question sort of arises, well, what is the thing that's there if it's not a particle and it's not a wave? What is it there until we probe it? And to understand that, go check out my two-part series called Quantum Mechanics Debunks Materialism, where I go into a lot of depth explaining those sorts of things. So there's a realization, of course, now with this relativity that judgment becomes impossible, because how do you judge a thing when you're aware of the fact that every judgment you make comes from some sort of arbitrary relative position, and depending on where you're standing, you're going to be judging things in different ways because you're going to be seeing them in different ways. How do you resolve that problem? Who is the ultimate arbiter? Whose judgment is the best? Well, a Christian might say, well, it's God, or a Muslim might say, well, it's the Quran. You just look in the Quran and, there it is written what are the right things to do. But that's the conventional stages. At the post-conventional stages, you can no longer rely on some sort of book as an authority. And, even like an expert or achiever might say, well, it's science. Science adjudicates what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. We can make scientific judgments. But even that needs to be questioned at the post-conventional stage, because you realize that, well, what is science? How do we know that science has some sort of absolute understanding and judgment upon the universe? Isn't science just one way of looking at the world? After all, how can you say science is the best way of discovering the truth when maybe there's meditation, when maybe there's psychic abilities, when maybe there's voodoo? How can you say that voodoo is less legitimate than science? This is what the post-conventional pluralist problem is. It's an epistemic problem that you start to face. Because now there's this, before there was just like a single worldview that you were locked into. Now it almost becomes the opposite problem. Now there's this proliferation. Once you open Pandora's box of relativity, everything becomes relative. All these different views multiply, and there's this sort of a cornucopia of different perspectives. And at the pluralist stage, you're struggling to make sense of it all. Because while there are all these different perspectives and views and cultures and lifestyles and cuisines and so forth, yes, that's all interesting and good, but at the same time, life still places very concrete demands upon you for survival. So the challenge for the pluralist is that while you're exploring all these views, you also have to try to manage life. And this can be difficult because when you become so relativistic that you stop judging things, it becomes difficult for you to make decisions in your own life. It becomes difficult for you to be able to distinguish between different levels and qualities of view, because not all views are necessarily equally practical. So one way that you can sort these views is on practicality. Does it work? Is it functional? Is it going to help to create a healthier life for me? But this sort of understanding really doesn't come online yet for the pluralist. So the pluralist is going to spend a good 5 or 10 years probably struggling with this, and this can create a lot of confusion and turmoil in one's mind. The pluralist also realizes that we cannot help but filter our observations through our personal and subjective lenses. This is a very important realization for the mind. It humbles the mind. It makes the mind start to become aware of its own biases. So what kind of lenses are you using to look at politics with, to look at religion with, to look at science with? See, at the conventional stages, a conventional scientist might say something like, well, science is just the objective method of discovering objective truth, and that's really all there is to science. You're either doing it very rigorously, or you're not. You're either being rational or you're not. But a post-conventional scientist would say, wait a minute, that's not all there is to the story. Even when I'm doing science, how do I know which forms of science, because there's not just one, there's many different varieties of science, many different ways to do science. So how do we know which ways of doing science are better than others? And does it even make sense to say that there's one best way to do science? Because after all, don't we have our personal biases? Because the scientist is not some objective, neutral, impartial observer, the way that conventional people think. The scientist is entangled with the science that he's doing. He has his biases and various metaphysical and epistemic assumptions that he brings to the table when he's doing his science. For example, Isaac Newton assumed that time and space were absolute. That was just taken for granted, and he did all his science based upon those assumptions. And then Einstein came along and he said, wait a minute, we can't take that for granted. What if time and space are not absolute? What if they're relative? And that opened up a whole, new domain basically for advanced physics, advanced cosmology, and so forth, which has borne amazing fruit. But it goes even beyond just the stuff that Einstein was doing or Niels Bohr or something like that. This problem of adjudicating and correcting for the biases in our own lenses when we're doing science, this is a very deep problem. And many scientists today, if they're conventional, they don't realize the depth of this problem. They think that they're just doing science objectively without realizing that their mind and their state of consciousness is very much the lens through which they're doing their science, which is distorting the science that they're doing. So their version of science becomes very limited. That doesn't mean that all the science is wrong or bad. It just means that you can expand beyond it in the same sense that Isaac Newton's mechanics, it wasn't strictly speaking wrong. We still use it. We still teach Newtonian mechanics in physics classes in high school and even in college, and it's extremely useful. But it's a scientific model which has certain limits. And then what Einstein did is he came along, created a new model which was broader, which had a higher elevation perspective, which incorporated Newton, but then allowed us to understand even more about reality. And so in general, that's sort of what's happening here, is that as your perspective expands, it's not necessarily that you're invalidating and disproving everything that came before you. You're just building on top of it, and you're seeing it and recontextualizing it in a higher, more relativistic perspective. That's what's really going on. And this can keep happening forever. You can keep zooming out and keep doing this forever, out and out and out. And that's what basically this whole process of development is about. There's an awareness at the pluralist stage of cultural conditioning. You're starting to see how much your culture programs you, and that you really are not in control of your own beliefs and values as much as you thought you were. The pluralist can no longer disregard the enormous diversity of people and their beliefs, values, and preferences. So in the past, in the conventional stages, a lot of the reason that they worked is because this was usually an earlier era where people lived in a less globalized society. There was no internet, there were no books, etc. And so you could just live in a little village or a little town your whole life, somewhere rural in the suburbs or whatever, and you didn't meet many diverse cultures. And therefore, you could maintain a very limited, narrow worldview based upon your community, and your community usually all thought the same, had the same beliefs, same values, same preferences. But now when you can just buy a ticket and travel around the world very cheaply, quickly, or you can just Skype people, Zoom people, and you can watch YouTube videos of people from Africa and from the Amazon, all this crazy stuff. Books are cheap and free, available everywhere all the time. It's easy. You can just download stuff. You can watch movies all around the world from different cultures. You can watch documentaries in 4K HD and all this. And so this makes the diversity so blatant and obvious that you can't deny it anymore. You can't just stay in your little bubble. To stay in your little bubble, you have to deny all of this stuff, all these different cultures and different cuisines. And so the more you travel around the world, the more you interact with different people of different diversities, what I meant to say, then it radically expands your worldview. And oftentimes that's all you need to do to move into post-conventional is just go travel around the world to exotic places. I don't mean other like conventional developed countries, but go travel, like if you're from a developed country, from America or from Europe, travel someplace exotic and different. Travel to South America, travel to Africa, travel to Asia, and explore India. I guarantee you that's not just gonna be an interesting experience for you. It's not just gonna be cool or mind-opening. It's going to actually lead you to an existential and moral crisis, because you're going to see things there. You're going to see crippling poverty. You're going to see disease. You're going to see inequality. You're going to see violence. You're going to encounter laws and norms and people eating insects and other weird animals and things. You're going to see such weird things there if you bother to look, that it's going to shock you. You're going to be in for a culture shock, which will then lead to an existential and an identity crisis, because you're going to start to ask yourself, well, I've been living in this little bubble my whole life, and look at how the rest of the world lives. It doesn't live the way that I live. I've been living in this, cushy American suburb environment, maybe where I grew up, and that's not how the rest of the world lives. And you'll see also how backwards the rest of the world is, and you'll also discover ways in which there's wisdom in the sort of primitive cultures as well that we've lost touch with here in the West, in more developed countries. So again, it's not all good and bad. There's pros and cons to it, but it will certainly jostle your worldview wide open. The pluralist starts to now see all worldviews as seemingly equally valid and worthy of consideration. This is both a good thing and a bad thing, because now you start to think of like Nazism as a legitimate, valid worldview. But is it really at the same level of worldview as like the worldview of a yogi or a saint? I mean, on a certain absolute sense, you could say they're equal. Who's to say that Hitler's worldview was any worse than Jesus's or the Buddha's? But also there is a difference. But that difference doesn't really become apparent until we go beyond pluralism, the pluralist stage to the next stage. So at this point, the pluralist is sort of lost in this proliferation of different worldviews, the diversity of worldviews, and isn't clear how to adjudicate between them, because that's sort of what relativity implies, is that you're losing your criteria for judging different things. Because who's to say? It's all relative. There's a desire in the pluralist to be fair and even-handed, so the pluralist sort of naturally just wants to value and honor all ideas equally. The truth becomes very difficult to find at this stage because everything starts to become relative, and the pluralist might even deny that there is such a thing as truth. Very commonly, a pluralist will say something like, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. And for conventional people, when they hear pluralists saying that, they can cringe at that, because they say, well, but what about the facts? What about objective reality? I mean, aren't you going crazy with your relativism? You're just saying that there's no such thing as truth anymore. We can't even agree on a basic fact. Like, can't we agree that car over there is red? I mean, isn't it red? We all agree it's red, right? So what's wrong with that? Isn't that a fact of nature? Well, it's tricky because it would seem so, but then when you go deeper in your consciousness and you go more post-conventional, you realize that actually it's not so easy to agree that car is red. For example, we have colorblind people who might not see the red car as being red. And I mean, that's just a very crude example. There's much more tricky examples of it. So the pluralist can fall into this trap of starting to believe that there's no such thing as truth. And then they get rigid about it and they say, well, no, there can't be truth because everything's relative. But then isn't that a truth? But see, so they're still wrestling with this. To them, this is not clear. At later stages, you will discover that actually there is such a thing as absolute truth, but it's not what the conventional people thought it was. It's something else. In fact, the absolute truth is that everything is totally relative. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Also, to the pluralist, the mind can now stand outside the system it grew up in and observe itself and its culture from above. It's a very good and important ability. The pluralist is good at questioning hidden assumptions, values, and beliefs. There's now a realization of self-deception as a defense mechanism. So your mind uses self-deception in order to construct its reality and to convince itself that the reality it constructed wasn't constructed, but that's just how reality is. That's how reality is created. I've talked a lot about this in the past in various episodes, but specifically if you want to learn more about self-deception, this powerful concept, check out my 3-part series called Self-Deceptions, Part 1, 2, and 3, where I go into many, many different self-deception mechanisms that the mind is capable of and how it tricks you into constructing reality. And that's a theme that I cover over and over again in various ways throughout all of my content, as I'm sure you're aware now. So with this realization of self-deception, and again, at this stage, it's only just beginning. So I don't want you to get the idea that, oh, well, if I'm a pluralist, that means I've completely eliminated self-deception because now I understand it. No, you're just barely beginning to open your mind to the possibility of self-deception. You have no idea yet how deep it really goes. You've just scratched the surface of self-deception. Whereas the conventional stages, they didn't even take self-deception seriously as a thing. The possibility that your own mind could be completely spin doctoring you, this wasn't a thing at the conventional stages. It just wasn't a possibility. But now it's becoming a possibility. There's an awareness of how easily the human mind fools itself. And not just the human mind of other humans, but of course, the human mind means my mind, because I'm a human. See? So while at the conventional stages, of course, people will admit that people fool themselves. They will always make an exception for themselves. See, the mind is clever here. So the game that the mind is playing is that it'll say, well, yeah, sure, there's lots of deluded people in the world. In fact, most of my enemies are deluded people. People who are not like me are all deluded people. But people who are like me are not deluded. We're aware of the absolute truth. Now, of course, that itself is the deception. As you come to realize at the higher stages. So if other people are so easily fooled, what are the chances that you are one of those people fooling yourself, thinking that you're an exception to this trend that everybody is so easily fooled? So now this comes into awareness, and self-deception and cultural bias become the greatest dangers now. The greatest dangers at the post-conventional stages are not some enemies out there. They are not the Nazis. They are not the terrorists. They are not the, whatever, the Satanist and the demon worshipers and the pedophiles and all this sorts of stuff. That's not the greatest danger. The greatest danger is your own mind and the beliefs and software that were programmed into your mind that was taken for granted, all the assumptions, the hidden assumptions that you never questioned, that you were indoctrinated with by your culture as you were growing up, including religion, science, politics, economics, and morality, and everything else. All of that. That's the greatest danger. That's a huge realization. If you can realize just this much, you're in the top 5% of people on this planet. It takes a lot of work to realize the significance of what I just said. Although it's pretty simple, and it's very obvious in retrospect, but so many people are in denial about it because this will lead to an existential crisis for you the first time you start to realize this. And it's not just something you realize once. This is a process of years. We're talking about years and decades of realizing how deeply you have deceived yourself, how deeply your culture has programmed you. There's a realization that things are always more complex than they seem. At the lower stages, it's very easy to act sort of arrogant where you learn a little bit about some topic and then you think you understand everything. Now at the post-conventional stages, you realize that all of my opinions and all of my theories, they're way too simple for dealing with the actual reality of the situation. So when it comes to something like, police brutality, at the conventional stages, you can sort of break it down into a couple of sides, like a sort of a binary. Well, let's fund the police more or let's defund the police. You're either pro-police or you're anti-police. Sort of this sort of stupid binary. But at the post-conventional stages, you realize, wait a minute, it's much more complex than that. There's not a pro-police, anti-police. This issue is complex. It involves training. It involves funding. It involves systems. It involves different cultural views. It involves morality. It involves politics. It involves all this sorts of stuff, but there's no clear, easy answer to the issue of how do you improve the police. Yeah, you can blame and point your finger, but blaming and pointing your finger at different sides doesn't resolve the problem. The pluralist mind is capable of venturing beyond culture. This is huge. There's an appreciation now in this mind of epistemology. Questions concerning the nature of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Most adults never bother to wonder, how do we know what we know? How do we know anything at all? How do we know science is true? How do we know rationality and logic can be trusted? How do we know we can trust religion? How do we know we can trust spirituality or anything from the New Age? How do we know anything? How do we even know that we exist? For conventionally minded people, these questions seem silly and abstract and stupid. Once you get into the post-conventional, you realize how important these questions are. In fact, you realize that these are the most important questions that you should be asking. So the pluralist is able to question how one comes to know and believe things. Now, a distinction is starting to be drawn between beliefs and reality. And that how we think reality is, that's totally separate from reality itself. And that even science, when we're doing science, that is not reality itself. That is us thinking about reality. Which again is totally separate from reality itself. Which of course opens the question or the door to the question of, well then what is reality itself, independent of us thinking about it and interpreting it and modeling it and theorizing about it and believing in it? What is that? Well, that's a very profound question, which will require more stages to fully understand. The pluralist realizes that all groups and societies see it as their mandate to mold the minds and hearts of their members. And of course, we're not just talking about other groups, we're also talking about my group and my society. So I am not immune to this. That's the key difference between a conventional and a post-conventional mindset, is that the post-conventional starts to realize that I am not immune to all of this brainwashing. I'm very much a part of it. So how do I break free of this brainwashing when even the books that I'm reading are just more brainwashing? When I go buy a book about how to unbrainwash myself, that book itself is the brainwashing that I have to unbrainwash myself from. See the problem here? Where we get into sort of strange loops and sort of these loops that feed back on themselves. That's exactly right. That's the problem of self-reflection, which will only fully get realized at much later stages. There's an awareness of how much society and environment has shaped one's point of view, one's worldview, beliefs, and values. The mind is seen as completely contingent on historical context, geographic place, economic circumstance, education, the structure of society, culture, media, advertising, and language. This is huge when you realize this. See, to most people, most conformist people, their mind simply cannot compute the simple fact that the only reason you're a Christian is because you were born in a Christian country to Christian parents. That's it. That's the only reason you're a Christian. If you were born in a Muslim country to a Muslim family, Muslim parents, you would be a Muslim. This does not compute to a fundamentalist religious person. And likewise, actually, there's an even deeper level to this problem, where for most atheists and scientific materialists, it does not compute that the only reason you're an atheist, scientific materialist, or a rationalist is because you were born in a developed country in the 21st century or the 20th century, maybe, at a certain era in history where materialism and science and rationality are taken as absolute truths, and you've adopted those through the education system and so forth. This does not compute in the minds of most scientists. They can't see past this. They think that actually the science and the materialism and the rationalism, that this is the one true way relative to all the other religious mumbo jumbo that's found in the history books that came before. But they can't see that, yes, science is more advanced and more correct, so to speak, than all the stuff that came before, but then there's new levels to science. There's things beyond science which science cannot comprehend because of the very nature and limits that science imposes on its own self. By being science, science blocks itself off from certain aspects of reality. But most scientists can't fathom this because they're just at the conventional level. There's also an appreciation of how media, advertising, culture, all of this influences us. There's an understanding now of also how much language plays a role. Before, language was taken completely for granted. Now, language is seen to actually structure our thoughts. We can only think the things that our language allows us to think. The distinctions that our language makes are the distinctions that then our mind categorizes reality in, projecting those distinctions and then sort of creating a feedback loop where we are using confirmation bias to then see our own projections and then to convince ourselves that that is what reality is actually like, when it's just relative, it's a perspective. You start to question the education system now. You start to see that there's no such thing as some objective, perfect education system. Every education system has certain biases and limitations in it, whether it's a religious or a secular education. And the structure of society now starts to be questioned, where before stuff like capitalism, for example, in America especially, we just take capitalism for granted as just the natural way that governments work, the way that economies work. But is it really so natural? You start to see how artificial it is. You start to see how it's manipulated and changed and socially constructed. There's nothing natural per se about capitalism, at least not in the way that it's actually done in developed countries. So you start to question that. Whereas someone who's a conformist doesn't question capitalism. They just believe that capitalism is right. And then again, if you grew up in communist China or in Soviet Russia, you would think that communism or socialism is superior and the right way to do it. And you really believe it's the right way. The funny thing is that these people on like Fox News, these conservative types who rail against socialism and Marxism and communism, that these very same people, the structure of their mind is such that if they just were born, rather than being born in America, if they were just born in Soviet Russia 50 years ago, they would be staunch Communist Party members, vehemently fighting for communism against capitalism. Because again, like I said in part 1, it's not the content that's so important, it's the structure of the mind. Yes, a capitalist, like a dogmatic capitalist and a dogmatic communist, it might seem like these are polar opposites, but actually, if you're looking at it from a higher elevation, you see that they're very similar to each other. Just their ideas are different. The content of their mind is different, but the structure of their mind is the same. They're both dogmatic in the same way. They're both failing to see the pros and cons and trade-offs of the other system. They're both stuck within their little narrow paradigm, and they're both busy defending it without being aware of what they're doing. They're both unable to step up to a higher elevation, look downwards, and to see how maybe the two could be reconciled as a sort of a yin and yang thing. So at the pluralist stage, there's a realization that the mind has far less control over being molded than you previously believed. At the conventional stages, yes, you thought there was brainwashing, but you didn't consider yourself to be brainwashed. Now, at the post-conventional stages, you realize, holy shit. Not only is there brainwashing, but I'm the biggest fool because I fooled myself into thinking that there was no such thing as brainwashing, and that itself was the brainwashing. The brainwashing was that I am the only one who wasn't brainwashed, which of course means I was the most brainwashed. You start to see that. See, that takes a sort of a meta self-reflection. You see how you need to take a higher meta perspective to be able to see that? Education itself is now seen as a source of self-deception. Even reading science textbooks and math textbooks, this itself can become a self-deception because you're taking them as an authority. And yes, 99% of science is taken on blind faith through authority. That's what you realize when you get to the post-conventional stages. At the conventional stages, you believe, no, Leo, science is not about authority. Science is not like religion. Science is totally different. Science is about facts. It's about empiricism. It's about studying things. It's about being rational. This is not based on authority. Then you realize, actually, 99% of everything you know about science is pure belief, no different than a Christian or a Muslim believes in Allah or Christ or whatever else. Have you ever actually done any science yourself? How much science have you actually done? Almost none. All of it is belief-based. All the science you learned in school was all belief-based. That's just how it is. But of course, people at the conventional stage are in denial about this because they need to draw a firm distinction between science and religion. And this is very threatening to start to admit that maybe science is no better than religion. Maybe science falls into the very same traps and problems that religion falls into. Maybe science is also an ideology. Maybe science is also a belief system. Maybe science also takes certain things for granted. Yeah, that's super threatening because then you have to wonder, like, well, then how do I discover what's true? If we can't do it through religion, if the Bible can't tell us, if my culture can't tell me what's true, if science can't even tell me what's true, how? Then it must be hopeless. Then there's no truth. And yeah, you're going to have to spend some years or decades struggling through all that. So understand that what I'm describing here is a long journey. Your mind needs to work through all of these questions and problems. I'm sitting here after doing 20 years of this epistemic work, now just spewing all this at you as though it was easy, but I racked my mind over this for thousands and thousands of hours. And now it's easy, in retrospect. It wasn't easy going through that process. It's very, very challenging, which is why most people don't do it. It's emotionally laborious. It's confusing. There's paradoxes and things you don't understand, and then your ego doesn't want to admit that it was wrong, and You start looking like a fool to yourself in retrospect. You start to look back at your past, at the arguments and conversations you've had with your friends and teachers, and you see how stupid you were, how all of your beliefs and all of your opinions and ideas, that they were just childish fairy tales. And yet you thought you were so right. This is extremely threatening, and very few people are willing to admit these things to themselves. Personally, I've been doing this work, this epistemic work, I've been doing it since I was like 16 years old. And honestly, it shocked me that most people my age weren't doing it. And then later I learned that people even who are twice my age weren't doing it. They're just not interested in it. And now I realize that's because they're stuck in conventional. And I was post-conventional. I was post-conventional basically since like 16 years old. Of course, I still had to work through conventional stages. I was just, tapping into it. Again, barely tapping into it. You have to realize that all of these stages and categories and so forth, there's a lot of depth to them. So you can kind of tap into it at a certain age, but that doesn't mean you fully understood it, exhausted it, or solidified yourself in it, or that you can fully embody it. Really, it's taken decades for me to be able to fully embody those original first glimpses and realizations I had when I was 16 years old or 20 years old of this epistemic stuff. So at the pluralist stage, there's also now a turning away from material achievements to inner experience and self-reflection. The inner world becomes so interesting now that getting some money or some sex or a fast car, these things become like child's play. You start to lose interest in them. And also probably because the stage prior to this was the achiever stage, so you've probably achieved a lot of that stuff. You probably did already earn some good money, and you probably did already get your fast car, and you had a house, and you had some sex, and you did some drugs, and you went partying, and you did all this stuff, and you've achieved already a good chunk in your life. And now you ask, well, what's more? It seems like I've already achieved so much. Am I just going to keep achieving more of the same? It doesn't really fulfill me anymore. There needs to be some deeper dimension to life. And so now you're ready to go into the inner dimensions, the dimensions of consciousness, the psychological dimensions. There's an ever deeper discovery of how subjective one's worldview is. This is both liberating and confusing. It's confusing because there's now unlimited ways of seeing the world, and you're struggling to make sense of it all. Remember, the ego's primary job is to make sense of the world. And so now what we're doing is we're sort of taking the way that you were making sense of the world, the conventional ways, we're pulling that rug out from under you, and we're not replacing it with anything. And so you're left in a sort of state of vertigo for years, and maybe for a whole decade, you will be in a state of vertigo, trying to just reorient yourself. And there's a very strong temptation to regress backwards and just to cling to something, let me go back to my religion. Let me just go back to science. Let me just find some way to anchor myself into some sort of cohesive way of making sense of the world. And that is the trap. If you really want to be courageous, you have to let go of the need for any kind of anchors and let yourself be groundless and rudderless for a while, maybe for a few years, maybe for a decade, as your mind is struggling to figure all this out, and as you're exploring all these different perspectives. So even though it's confusing and can be emotionally taxing, it's also hugely liberating in the sense that now you have so many more options and possibilities. You're not straitjacketed anymore to one way of doing things, to one way of doing spirituality, to one way of searching for truth. Now you have multiple ways, and that's great. Some of them are going to be terrible, but some of them, a few of them, you'll discover are going to be way better than anything you thought or had before. Now at the pluralist stage, it becomes interesting just watching oneself trying to make sense of oneself. You ever done that? You're doing something and then you're just watching yourself doing it and seeing how like a monkey you are, how you're just like a robot, like a zombie, just going through the motions of doing something. And then maybe even the question enters your mind, why am I even doing this thing in the first place? I never even questioned why I should do this thing. Why should I go to church? Why should I read the Bible? Why should I wash my hands? Why should I read a book? Why should I do these? Now, some of them are legitimate to do. Maybe washing your hands is a good idea, especially these days. But then some of those things you realize the only reason I was doing them is because I was like a monkey imitating others who were doing those things. And I thought they were smart. And then I realized that they weren't smart. They were just pretending to be smart because they were just copying other monkeys who were pretending to be smart. But actually, none of them were smart. So who's really smart? How do I even determine what smartness means anymore? The pluralist now abandons purely rational analysis in favor of more holistic, organismic approaches, which take into account feelings, intuitions, and context. This is huge, huge, huge. You see this problem a lot on YouTube. You see a lot of YouTubers who are in that spiral dynamic stage orange zone where they're hardcore scientific materialists. I call them also rationalists. Atheists often they are. And they love to criticize religious people. They love to criticize Deepak Chopra and all the woo-woo stuff and Teal Swan and they'll just jump on anything New Age. They'll just jump on. Of course, they do the same thing to me. This is the pre-trans fallacy that Ken Wilber has beautifully articulated and labeled. Like if you go to the rationalist wiki, there's a rationalist Wikipedia. It's a complete mockery of rationality and science, but they pretend as though they're being rational and scientific. But if you go there, you can find me. You can search my name in there. You're going to find a terrible entry that completely misconstrues everything that I say in the name of course, debunking me. So they think that they can debunk me by just, going through these scientific materialist, rationalist talking points of how, he's just some new age cult leader, blah, 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 blah. Not realizing that they're just falling into the pre-trans fallacy. And I totally get it. I don't really hold it against them. They just can't do any better because they're stuck in rationality. So the post-conventional realizes the limitations of rationality. It actually realizes that intuition is more powerful than rationality. And it starts to feel and to get a lot of wisdom and insight into reality from feeling, from consciousness, rather than through linear logical thinking or proof or analysis. The idea that for a thing to be true, it has to be formally proven. This is one of the most toxic and unscientific ideas that exists amongst people who otherwise consider themselves to be scientific. So the pluralist now is going from the purely logical into the psychological domain. You see, because actually what you realize is that one of the chief ways in which your mind fools you and deceives you is with logic. Because logic can be used by the mind. Actually, the left hemisphere is responsible for logic in right-handed people. If you're left-handed, then it's reverse. The left hemisphere is responsible for logic and for the logical way in which the ego basically lives inside of logic, inside the left hemisphere. And it's responsible for dissecting the world and for rationalizing everything in order to preserve the ego. So this is what the rationalists and scientists and atheists don't understand. They don't understand that by just taking logic for granted, that opens a sort of a back door for the ego to co-opt that logic and to use that logic to justify whatever it wants. Every evil and deluded person in the history of mankind has considered himself to be rational and logical and has used reasons and logic to justify his evilness and his delusion. It doesn't matter whether they're religious or scientific, theists or atheists or anything else. Everybody has logic. The question is, are you using your logic well? And ironically, when you're being very strict about your logic and you're demanding everything to be logical and you deny anything that isn't logical, that is a misuse of logic. The highest use of logic and reason is to realize the limits inherent to logic and reason and then to let it go. That doesn't mean that you become illogical and irrational like a fool. You can still do logic and you can still reason, but you're careful about it now. Logic becomes self-aware at this stage, or at least it's starting to. It's starting to. And in order for logic to become self-aware, it has to become psycho-logical, psycho-logical. You have to now start to take into account the various sneaky psychological ploys and tricks that your mind employs when it's doing logic. There's now an exploration of experience, and discovery is more interesting and important than reaching a goal or making a product. So a pluralist would rather just explore different perspectives, maybe travel around the world, experience new people and relationships, rather than just working like some achiever towards some money goal or to launch some product. There tends to be a distrust at the pluralist stage of conventional wisdom and hyper-rational methods. And this is a good and valid distrust because they can't be trusted. Scientific certainty and the judgmental frame breaks down. Pluralists like to scrutinize their own assumptions, and they relish in the novel mental freedom that comes at this stage. All values are now seen as relative, but survival still demands making choices and judgments, which the pluralist struggles with. Rather than solving problems, one must figure out what to define as the problem at this stage. See? As the cliche Einstein quote goes, I mean, it's cliche because it's really good, it's very appropriate, is that you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that was used to create it. And that's what you realize with the the post-conventional stages. Problems are now seen as an interplay between polarities, neither one of which can simply be eliminated. The conventional traditional mind thinks that, all we got to do to make the world good is just kill all the evil people. If we kill all the rapists, murderers, and pedophiles and terrorists, the world will be a paradise. And then you realize, no. That attitude itself is exactly what makes the world evil. You can't just kill all the criminals and rapists and terrorists. First of all, because in the process of doing so, you yourself will become a criminal, rapist, and a terrorist. But also because the reason that these terrorists and criminals and so forth exist is actually differences in perspective. They have different agendas than you, different perspectives than you. And so who's to say who deserves to be killed? You see, when you think you can just improve the world by killing everybody else who you don't like, who doesn't fit your perspective, well, but then everybody else also will think of the world and approach the world in that way. You see, so if a Christian believes that, well, we should kill all the Muslims, and a Muslim believes, well, we should kill all the Christians, and a Buddhist believes, well, we should kill those two, then what do you got? You've got chaos. You've got war. What's necessary is actually an understanding of the difference in perspective that all three have, and to see that actually we can find common ground between these perspectives such that we don't need to kill each other. We can mutually coexist. We can find a way in which we can actually find common ground, work together. And to do that, we need to be able to see through each other's eyes rather than demonizing each other or thinking that the world would just be better if those people didn't exist. And a lot of scientific people fall into this trap as well. They convince themselves that, well, if religion just didn't exist, the world would be a great place. Let's kill all the religious people. Or maybe they don't go that far, but they'll say something like, if we could just get rid of all the churches, in 100 years, all of religion will be gone. I know because I used to think this way. I went through a hard rationalist, scientific materialist phase in my life, an atheist phase in my life, where I remember I would tell myself something like, in 100 years, all of religion will be gone and mankind will be freed up and there will be this flowering of science and rationality that will transform society and everything will be peachy. I had this fantasy. I didn't understand that that's just the same problem as, a Muslim thinking that just, get rid of all the infidels and the world will be a better place. It's not going to work that way. The pluralist enjoys paradox and contradiction without needing to eliminate them. That's a huge step forward. The conventional mind cannot deal with paradox. Conventionally minded, rational, and logical people, they don't understand paradox. Their mind cannot handle strange loops, cannot deal with circular causality, and that sort of stuff. And in fact, they take paradox as evidence of contradiction. And in fact, they use the paradoxes that result from postmodern and post-conventional thinking. They use that as evidence on their side for the fallaciousness of postmodernism and post-conventional thinking, when actually it's not. This is not a bug. This is a feature. The post-conventional mind sees paradox as a feature, not a bug, and it can even relish in the paradox. Paradox can be seen as delicious and beautiful. That's ultimately where you want to get to with paradox, because paradox is the core feature of reality, we might say. And I'm going to shoot an episode in the future that's going to be all about paradox and how paradox works. And I've already talked about it a little bit in a couple of episodes, my Gödel's incompleteness theorem episode, and also in my reality is a strange loop episode. So check those out if you want to see more about that. So linear logic gives way to a more holistic understanding. Not everything needs to be proven in order to be embraced at the postmodern stage, at the pluralist stage. Value is placed upon insight and breakthrough, like the kind of insights you get through contemplation or through meditation. These are dismissed by the conventional mind as just being subjective hallucinations or something, which was why many scientists don't take insight seriously, when in fact insight is the core foundation of all scientific breakthrough. But it takes a genius scientist to really be capable of understanding the power of insight and what insight is. There's now a playful exploration at this pluralist stage, and the imagination is set free. Because you've got so many perspectives. And the more perspectives you explore, the more creative your mind becomes, and you see new possibilities, new interesting combinations, because creativity is basically a combination of diverse source material. And so now your source material exponentially explodes, and so does your creativity and your imagination. The pluralist now looks for connections and subtle clues rather than analyzing independent parts. So the pluralist is all about connecting the dots. That's going to be sort of the mode of understanding reality. Whereas at the conventional stages, like the expert and the achiever, their whole way of understanding reality was just to dissect it into parts. And to think that the parts, once we dissect them all, if we add them all together, it's just going to be the same as if we split them all apart. So the sum and the separate parts, that they're all the same. But the pluralist realizes that the sum is not the same as the independent parts. Something is lost when you dissect an animal, or you throw a frog into a blender and you blend it up and you break it down into a bunch of cells and molecules. That is not the same thing as a fully functioning frog. You can't understand a frog by throwing it into a blender and then looking at it under a microscope. You can only understand a very narrow sliver of what a frog is by looking at it that way. You also have to look at it psychologically. You have to look at it sociologically. You have to look at it zoologically. You have to look at it spiritually. You have to look at it in a sort of in a social way. You have to look at it in a political way. There's so many different ways that you can understand what a frog is and how it fits into the larger universe than just throwing it into a blender and dissecting it under a microscope. Useful information can now come from beyond science at this stage. Sources that used to be viewed with ridicule and skepticism, such as intuition, feeling, dreams, meditation, self-reflection, insight, these now become highly valued. And you can see this, like the Rationalist Wiki. If you go look at Rationalist Wiki, all their different page entries, not just on me, but on everybody else, that they cover, the sort of debunking attitude that they take. A lot of times what they're sort of doing is they're ridiculing and they're misusing skepticism in order just to perpetuate their scientific, materialist, conventional worldview without realizing that that is what they're doing. They just take skepticism and rational ridicule as somehow being, the height of human intelligence, when really it's not. It's quite stupid. Check out my episode called True versus False Skepticism, where I talk about how skepticism is misused and weaponized by rationalists and how to use skepticism properly. There's a lot of value to skepticism, and I consider myself a skeptic. That's how I started doing philosophy, is with skepticism. But man, you can really misuse skepticism, and you see it all over YouTube. All over YouTube these days, it's so popular just to ridicule anything that doesn't fit the sort of traditional, conventional, rational, scientific materialist paradigm. Just ridicule it with this very flimsy, false skepticism. People will ridicule insight, they will ridicule meditation, they will ridicule spiritual techniques, they will ridicule yoga, they will ridicule chakras, they will ridicule various healing modalities, they will ridicule intuition, and they will ridicule feelings and emotions, they will ridicule femininity, they will ridicule holistic thinking, because their mind just wants to dissect reality in a very linear, analytical way, and they don't know any other way to understand reality. They have it in their minds that that's the only way, when in fact it's just one way out of an infinite number of ways. Big picture thinking becomes important to the pluralist. There's now a shift from being to feeling. From doing to being and feeling. So the achiever was all about running around doing stuff, and the pluralist is like, no, let's sit back, let's feel, let's get in touch with our being. Now, of course, oftentimes to a conventionally minded rationalist person, this feeling and being stuff seems hippie and new agey and woo-woo, and it seems like it's not real. It doesn't seem tangible. But that's because, it's a more advanced way of interfacing with reality than just logicking everything to death or grabbing something by the throat, the way that you were used to at the lower stages. See, as you go higher in the stages, your consciousness becomes more abstract. You're capable of doing abstraction at higher and higher levels and higher elevations. And so therefore, the reason this New Age stuff can feel kind of airy-fairy is because in a sense it is. It's more spiritual, spirit meaning breath, meaning it's more ephemeral, it's more abstract, it's more purely conscious rather than grossly material. You can't necessarily grab it with your hand, but that doesn't make it any less real or any less true. In fact, actually it's more real, it's more true, the more abstract your insights get. So this is something that a conventional mind doesn't understand. There's now an awareness at the pluralist stage of how emotions aren't just in the head, but are diffused throughout the whole body. So the mind-body connection is now recognized as a valid, legit thing, and it's actually seen as very important. And that actually what you discover is that while you were in the conventional stages, you were so stuck in your head that you often had even diseases and ailments in your body because you were disconnected from your body. You were carrying around anger, sadness, frustration, trauma in your body from childhood. You were carrying this stuff around with you, and as you start to feel into it, it starts to release. But just that feeling in process itself can be scary. It can be threatening. It can feel alien because many people in the world haven't even felt their bodies, haven't felt emotions. They've never consciously experienced anger or sadness because they just numb themselves out with television, with porn, with drugs, with food, and all this sort of stuff. They self-medicate in all these different ways to avoid feeling. And also because they think so much, they're stuck in their heads that they don't realize that these emotions are actually not in the head, they're in the body. And so when you start to realize the importance of integrating the mind and the body together, this opens up a whole new domain of self-improvement work, of spiritual work, of healing work. But of course, a lot of traditionally minded people will think of this as just new age, airy-fairy nonsense. And of course, it seems that way from their perspective because they're stuck in their head, they're thinking about it, they're not actually feeling into it. You can't understand feeling and emotion by thinking about it more. You have to realize, oh, thinking about it is not how you actually feel. Let me stop thinking. Let me start feeling. Let me really become conscious of my emotions. Let me do some mindfulness practice. But for that, your mind has to be open. See, so for most people, like it was for me, you're probably going to spend a good 5 years kind of resisting it. And then it'll take you another 5 years to start to actually feel. And there's going to be a long, multi-year process of gradually feeling into your various emotions and slowly opening up your body, maybe by doing yoga or whatever, maybe doing some shamanic breathing like I had an episode in the past. And that will establish the mind-body connection. And you will realize that how you feel in your body is oftentimes related to how you think. Whereas at the conventional stages, if someone has a disease or someone has depression, they will tend to attribute it to a material cause, like, oh, I'm depressed because of, some material, I don't have enough money. That's why I'm depressed. So let me either go get more money or let me go get some antidepressant pills, which will solve my depression for me. That's how a sort of conventional mind thinks. Whereas a post-conventional mind will start to say, wait a minute, maybe my depression is more psychologically based. Maybe there's trauma in the past I haven't dealt with. Maybe it's just the fact that I'm not fully feeling in my emotions. Let me feel, where is the depression in my body? Maybe it's in my chest. Maybe it's in my heart. Maybe it's in my hands. Maybe, what might be the cause of that? And you start to explore that. You start to maybe do some body work or, bioenergetic type stuff or whatever, yoga. And then you start to establish that mind-body connection. And then you realize that, oh, the depression wasn't some material thing. It was more of a spiritual thing, more of a psychological thing. And then that opens up new ways of dealing with it, healthier ways. So there's a recognition at this pluralist stage that feelings, thoughts, and the body sensations all intertwine and affect each other. How you think affects how you feel, but also how you feel affects how you think. What you put in your body affects how you think and how you feel. How you use your body can expand your ability to be creative and so forth. And this is not just airy-fairy, new agey stuff. I mean, it's real. Just go actually try this stuff and you will see these very real connections between these things. You can't separate the mind from the heart, the logical from the intuitive, or facts from feelings. this stupid binary idea of like, oh, there's facts and then there's your feelings, man. So like the rational people, the sane people, they just go with the facts. That very distinction between facts and feelings that Ben Shapiro likes to use, that itself is grounded all in his own feelings. There's nothing factual or logical or objective or rational about what Ben Shapiro is doing. He's being completely ideological and governed. Everything he's doing, every show he does, everything coming out of his mouth is completely governed by his ego, which is all governed by feelings. But he's so disconnected from it. He's so robotic. You can tell in the way he holds his body, his facial muscles, all this stuff. It's so, you can see he's trying to hold it together to kind of play that good boy, Judeo-Christian kind of like conformist stereotype of what a good Jew has to be. And yeah, it's extremely predictable. There's nothing intelligent about it. It's just he's behaving like a robot. And I'm not trying to pick on him. It's just he's one good example of millions of people who live this way. They're very, very repressed. When you repress your sexuality, you also have to repress your whole body. Your muscles have to be tight. You have to, you're denying yourself. That's what a lot of Christians and Catholics, Muslims and so on, they deal with this sort of the guilt and the pressure of constantly having to deny your animal urges. But at the pluralist stages are sort of opening up. And this is where the hippies come from. So the hippies very much were pluralists. And so the hippies are into free love and they're into psychedelics. Their minds are more open. They're into exploring different cultures and so on. Yeah. But then, of course, the hippies get demonized. Why do the hippies get demonized? Who do the hippies get demonized by? They get demonized by these hyper-rational people or the conformist people. It's the conformists, the achievers, and the experts, and opportunists, I guess, as well, who all demonize the hippies. Because the hippies is that sort of that next quantum leap from the conventional thinking to the post-conventional ways of thinking, which is very threatening to them. It takes a lot of work to become a hippie. Being a hippie is very advanced. See, that's what many of the rationalists don't understand. They think a rationalist thinks, like a rational scientist thinks he's more developed than a hippie. Actually, he's not. Unless he happens to be a scientist and a hippie, then maybe he is. You can also do that at higher stages. So logic and science are no longer absolutes, but one out of many different valid epistemic modes. Pluralists are concerned with making a unique and personal contribution to the world, independent of any socially approved roles or tasks. Pluralists often withdraw from external affairs and company life to or ordinary daily routines. So they like to live more unconventionally, which of course also corresponds with hippies. Hippie doesn't want to be a square. A square is basically a word that hippies invented for all the conventional thinking people who just go to a 9-to-5 job and just, punch a clock and work at a factory or, work on Wall Street. These are squares. Ben Shapiro is a square. Don't be a square. The pluralist likes to turn inward instead and to search one's own unique gifts and answers to one's own burning questions. That's what the search becomes about. It's about self-exploration and self-expression. That's what hippies are into. Now, of course, also, don't get me wrong. When I say the word hippie, I'm stereotyping. It doesn't mean that you literally have to become that stereotypical hippie who has long hair and, smokes weed and is, can't keep a job. Just be careful with the stereotype, because there's a lot of demonization that has happened of the postmodern worldview. A very common misconceptions I see is people say, well, if I become a pluralist, like you're saying here, I'll become a hippie, and that means I won't be able to have a job. I won't be able to raise kids. I won't be a responsible adult. I won't have any money. I'll be broke. No, it doesn't have to mean that. Those are all extreme stereotypes. Yes, you can become a hippie to such an extreme that you become homeless and you live out of a 1960s style Volkswagen van, dealing pot on the side to make money, to buy your organic kombucha, and then you're going to music festivals, and like that becomes your whole life. And you're wearing like a poncho, like a dirty poncho. Reminds me of that Homer Simpson episode about hippies where Homer becomes a hippie. Anyways, yeah, these are gross exaggerations. It doesn't have to be this way at all. A pluralist can be capable, can be a computer programmer, can maintain a job. You can still maintain the abilities of the lower stages. You can still have money as a pluralist and so on. Let's just be careful. Pluralists are good at finding novel ways of looking at problems. They like to inspire others to pursue their own interests. Explore yourself, man. Like that. Go on a personal journey. Go on a vision quest. Hippies will tell you that. Pluralists can sometimes appear amoral because they seem so relativistic. I'm commonly accused of that. I think a lot of people, when they watch my content, think of me as some sort of amoral person because I can be extremely relativistic in the way that I speak about things, like murder and rape and terrorism. I can speak very relativistically about these things because I'm not attached to them. I don't demonize these things. And that makes me look immoral. Actually, it's a higher level of morality. It's a sort of a transcendent morality where you're not attached to demonizing anything, and you see the validity of every perspective. Even when you look at a rapist, you understand the rapist's perspective. That's very threatening to many conventionally minded people because they've made a cottage industry and their whole life have been demonizing these bad people, these criminals. They've been demonizing them for so long that even in their own mind, to be able to look at a rapist or a criminal or a terrorist relativistically without judging them, that to them already is evil. They judge themselves for not being judgmental. And then they judge me and they judge others who are not judgmental enough for them. They judge us as, being evil and criminals and satanic and all this because, hey, Leo, if you were a good person, you should judge rapists and you should judge Hitler and you should judge Nazis and you should hate them. And you should hate terrorists. No, man, that's your square way of thinking. I'm beyond that, so I don't have to play by your rules. One of the chief anxieties for pluralists is integrating the different sub-aspects of one's own psyche. So you start to realize that there are different parts of yourself. There's a feminine side, there's a masculine side, there's a hippie side to you, there's a square side to you, there's a rational side, there's an intuitive side, there's an emotional side, there's a hyper-stoic side, and you have to sort of corral and make all these work together. And so this is a big challenge for the pluralists, because at the conventional stages, this wasn't done. These subparts were denied. So once you start to allow them in to have a conversation with each other, that presents its own challenges because they all want competing different things. You have to somehow pacify them and reconcile them, integrate them. For the pluralist, there's a fear of being reabsorbed into the lower stages of the rat race. Those square stages are perceived to be the rat race. There's a dread that one's work life won't allow for individual self-expression and creativity. Hippies hate that. It can feel isolated at this pluralist stage. You can feel isolated from others who don't understand the post-conventional mindset, because most people are conventional. So here you start to feel like you're kind of lonely. You don't know how to find like-minded friends, which just means you have to upgrade your friends to more post-conventional ones. There can be relationship problems, especially when one partner like you is post-conventional, but your spouse or your girlfriend or your boyfriend is conventional, and they don't understand your post-conventional ways. They want to kind of drag you down to be conventional like them, but you fear going back to that square way of living, and to you it just feels inauthentic, and so you can't do that. And so there's now a conflict, although both of you are still probably not going to be aware enough to realize that that is what's causing the conflict. There are a couple of traps here with this pluralist stage. One is that it tends to judge all hierarchies as oppressive without recognizing the validity of some hierarchies. Two is it trapped that it tends to treat all opinions, values, and worldviews as equally valid, when in fact they aren't equally all valid from a survival standpoint. And in the end, if you're here and you're alive, you're going to have to be making decisions and certain evaluations. But there are healthy and unhealthy ways of making evaluations. You can make evaluations without being judgmental about it. Another trap is that extreme relativism leads to indecision and false equivalency. Well, it's sort of similar to what I was just saying. And then another trap is that diversity and equality itself can become an oppressive position. So this is sort of like some of those extreme social justice warriors who just kind of go overboard with their egalitarianism, and then they start to go so overboard. They want everything to be so equal and so diverse that actually ends up sort of backfiring, and it turns into oppression. Some of the conservatives love to complain about this. Most of the time, they overblow this. It does happen, but it happens a lot less than right-wingers will portray on YouTube. That's for sure. It's a lot less of a problem than someone like Jordan Peterson would like you to believe. Although he's made his whole career out of this like one point. And many of the intellectual dark web type of people have made entire careers out of just over-exaggerating the problem of pluralism on this point of diversity and equality, sort of the whole cancel culture stuff. It's really a distraction from understanding the value that pluralism provides as a worldview. This is an enormous leap in consciousness to get to pluralism, and yet it's so dismissed and so demonized by the right. It's quite disgusting and quite dysfunctional and problematic. But don't get me wrong, also these pluralists, they're not perfectly non-judgmental. They certainly will judge others who do not hold their egalitarian beliefs. Is that a contradiction? Of course it is. but they're not yet conscious enough to see that contradiction, nor are they spiritually developed enough. Their ego is not small enough to the point where they can just let go of all judgment, including the judgment of those who judge and those who don't hold egalitarian hippie ideals. The pluralist still doesn't fully appreciate that others are not as developed as they are. They're generally very tolerant of diverse ideas, behaviors, and reactions and cultures. But they can come off as dreamers and non-doers because they're not so concerned with material achievements as the previous stages, because they're more deeply concerned with their interiors. They tend to prefer to live on the fringes of society. They are capable of entertaining contradicting ideas, and they tend to have an attitude of, well, it just all depends, man. It all depends. So if you come to a pluralist and you ask them, hey, what should I do? Should I go to college or not? Should I get married or not? Should I leave my religion or not? They'll say, well, it all depends. There's no simple answer. Okay, and with that, we've spent way too much time on the pluralist. Let's move on to the autonomous strategist, which represents about 5% of the US adult population. So the strategist can take a systems view of reality. A strategist can comprehend multiple interconnected systems of relationships and processes both internally and externally. The first stage here, this is the first stage that recognizes the need and value of all the lower stages. So this is huge. One's perspective becomes so high that one's realizes that all the lower perspectives, so to speak, are all necessary and play their function. In the same way that you recognize when you're an adult that kids need to go through different grades in school, and that just because your kid is in 5th grade doesn't mean he's bad or wrong or evil. He's in 5th grade because that's the age he's at, and that's what he needs to, that's the material he needs to go through to move on to 6th grade and to 7th grade and to 8th grade and then ultimately to become like you. So how can you judge and demonize him for doing that when you did it yourself? When you see yourself moving through all these different stages, when you remember how it was like to be a conformist and then to be an expert and then to be stuck in rationalism at the achiever level and so on, when you remember all this and you sympathize, empathize with it, then you have compassion for all these different perspectives and you realize that, yeah, people are stuck oftentimes in these stages, but judging them for it, demonizing them for it, is not going to work. That's a low consciousness way of dealing with the situation. This is the first stage that really expresses and embodies the global worldview. The pluralist stage that came before can express, can talk about the global worldview, but can't fully embody it yet because it's still too judgmental. Because most of the world is not as developed as they are. But the strategist is now developing this capacity, a truly global worldview, an inclusive worldview. The strategist can perceive systemic patterns and long-term trends. There's a sense of oneself as part of an ongoing history. The strategist sees oneself through an evolutionary lens, not just the self, but society and the whole world. All of us are going through this evolutionary process. It's a messy, challenging, chaotic process that involves many different overlapping systems. And we're all a part of it. We're all entangled with it. And the strategist is able to see that and to appreciate it and to kind of project forward. The strategist can look backwards at the evolutionary path of society and then the self, himself, herself, one's culture as well, and then project that forward as well. We can project forward the evolution of mankind, of our society, of our culture, of our country, of our family, of our company, and of ourselves. Thoughts and feelings can no longer be isolated, forming a dynamic interplay. The strategist can now make meaning autonomously, independent of conventional ideas. Now there's an idea to actually generate new ideas and new meanings independently of culture or your society or what your coworkers are doing or what your teachers and friends are doing or what your family is doing. To truly think independently, this is such a rare ability. And I'll talk about that. I'll have a whole episode in the future about how to truly think independently. It's a huge game changer if you learn to do it. The strategist takes responsibility for their interpretation, valuation, and sense-making and life stories. This is huge. Most of the prior stages find clever ways to shirk responsibility. And even the pluralist will still shirk responsibility. But the strategist is taking a lot more responsibility. And basically that's what going up all these stages are. When you get to the very highest stages, you become so responsible for everything. Because you realize that there's literally nobody to blame other than your own mind. And so you take responsibility for how your mind is interpreting, evaluating, and making sense and meaning out of reality. And this changes everything for you. The strategist is consciously committed to making a meaningful life for herself and others through self-actualization. The strategist has successfully integrated those sub-personalities and sub-identities that I was talking about with the pluralist just a few moments ago. Has already integrated those, and so the strategist is more grounded there, not so torn and confused as the pluralist was. The strategist is what you become after you've gone through maybe a 5 or 10 years of the pluralist sort of flailing around, playing with different perspectives, being kind of hippy-dippy and airy-fairy and wishy-washy, and maybe sometimes not so practical, but then you kind of, out of all that, something starts to congeal and come together, something more solid, and that's what the strategist is. The sense of self in the strategist is both differentiated and integrated at the same time. Remember, I talked about how these stages oscillate between differentiation and integration of the ego self? Well, this is now starting to bear fruit as something cohesive and whole. The strategist tends to have a sense of transformational mission. The strategist is not just here on this planet to enjoy himself, to titillate herself with pleasures of the body or even the mind. The strategist is here on a larger mission. The strategist is infused with a grand purpose and vision of what could be, of what mankind could become, of what the world needs to move forward in the evolutionary process. So the strategist is sort of a midwife to the birthing of a new humanity through this evolutionary process by understanding it and working with the various systems that are involved. And by transforming oneself through self-actualization to become better in helping, to become a better midwife for mankind in whatever way that is. There's many different ways in which you could be a midwife for mankind. Don't take it literally. It's a figurative, abstract way of speaking about it. The strategist worries most about failing to observe universal principles. So they tend to be very principled people. They want honesty, authenticity, truth, whatever principles they hold, they will tend to want to walk their talk, not just talk, but actually hold themselves to that high standard. And oftentimes one of their downfalls is that they will guilt themselves for not being able to meet these, high principles and high standards, because it's difficult to transform the human animal, the human chimp, in order to fit in with these universal principles and ideals, to be free of self-bias, to be always truthful, to be authentic, to be independent and not reactive, to not be just blindly emotional, to not just be strictly hyper-rational, to follow and observe these principles, principles of universal justice and compassion and so on, non-judgmentalism. This is very difficult. You got to really work for decades to train the human monkey mind to be able to actually walk that talk. There's a deep appreciation now of how challenging it is to be a mature, responsible adult and how rare one's capacities are. So if you're a strategist, you're in the top 1 to 5% of the population, and what you've achieved is remarkable, is very, very rare, and you're in a unique position now to be a leader and to help mankind to figure out all of the stuff that you've figured out. And because you've gone probably through decades of inner work to get to where you are, because you weren't born this way, certainly not, and you didn't just learn this in school, you had to teach this to yourself if you got this far. Now you can help others to do the same. Unlike pluralists, strategists have a more realistic sense of what it takes to actually change old patterns, habits, and systems. So a lot of times these hippie, airy-fairy pluralists, they will get some utopian ideas of how to transform society, which will not work because they don't take into account the actual evolutionary developmental process that most human psyches have to go through and have not yet gone through. But the strategist can now see that, and the strategist can now manipulate and work with the systems in such a way that it will allow people to, that old idea of moving up the spiral. So this is sort of the spiral wizard idea. You're helping others by meeting them where they're at, rather than just assuming that that they will just buy into your hippie ideas. I know that I heard a news report a few years ago, some years ago, probably 5 or more years ago, where some hippie lady wanted to fly to Syria and Iraq. This was right in the middle of the sort of the heyday of ISIS and beheadings and so forth. She wanted to fly there and to present her hippie ideas to them of peace and love and all this, without realizing that these people in Syria, these warlords in Syria and Iraq, they're not going to care about your ideas of hippie love and so forth. They will kill you. They will behead you if you let them. So don't think that they're going to sit there in a drum circle with you. That works with your hippie friends in San Francisco, or in Austin, Texas, or wherever in California, but it's not going to work in Syria and Iraq. And the pluralist doesn't understand that, but the strategist does. So the strategist plans for that. And so in this sense, the strategist is a bit more grounded and realistic especially with their political ideas. The strategist wants to hone oneself as an instrument of change, you see, because you appreciate that to be able to lead mankind towards those ambitious visions that you have, you need to work a lot on yourself, because you realize that I'm not good enough to do it yet. The strategist is very painfully aware of his or her own foibles and underdeveloped shadow aspects, because the strategist is not perfect, but the strategist is uniquely aware of his own imperfections, which is a great thing. That doesn't mean you fix them all, but at least it means that you're aware enough to be sort of humble about it, and also to have a sort of a plan and to see the importance of fixing that stuff in the future. See, for example, for me, I know that if I want to lead people to amazing things that I know are possible for mankind in the future, I need to work so much on myself. And that's what I've spent the last 5 years doing. I could have poured all this time and money into my business to earn more money, to put out more juicy, clickbaity videos and so forth. I would have had double the subscribers that I have now if I did that. But I made a deliberate choice to actually solidify my content and really work on myself, understanding this content deeply for myself, such that when I speak and teach, that it's coming from a deep personal understanding of this stuff, rather than just stuff that I read in books and just regurgitating, beliefs that I found elsewhere and so forth. Because I need to be able to actually embody this stuff. Otherwise, the work is going to be phony, and then it's not going to be able to serve people properly. See, the best way that I can serve you is to fully embody the things that I say, and I say a lot more than I'm able to embody. So sometimes people get the wrong idea that just because I talk about something that I'm able to perfectly embody it. That's not the case at all. First, you have to be able to understand it and articulate it. Then it'll take you years and decades to fully live into it, actualize it, embody it. And so I work on that a lot behind the scenes. You don't really see me struggling through it, but I do. I struggle through it every day, and I'm painfully aware of all of my inadequacies. Some people like to criticize me so much. I've read thousands of comments over the years of people criticizing me and telling me things that they think I don't know about myself. It's like, oh, Lee, you're being arrogant, and you're doing this, and you're doing this to there, and oh, you're being self-biased here. It's like, yeah, I'm already aware of all that. So first, you have to become aware of it. That's a big step. Then the next big step, of course, is resolving the stuff you're aware of and then changing it. That's even harder. So, I'm slowly chipping away at it. There's a lot of work left to do. But yeah, it can be very painful to become aware of all of your own inadequacies. I don't just mean like inadequacies in the sense that like, I'm not good looking enough. I don't look alpha enough. I don't have big enough muscles. Like these are the issues that a conventional, achiever mind might be concerned with. But at this strategist level, the mind is more concerned of the sort of deeper existential inadequacies, psychological inadequacies that one has. Because now you're not worried about having big muscles or something or attracting girls at this stage. You're more concerned about how do I help mankind? And you're very aware of how limited you are in that. And you're aware of how much work mankind needs, how much help they need. But also at the same time, you're aware of how much help you need, but also you're aware of how much help you've already given yourself through, decades of inner work and self-actualization and so forth. And you're aware of how challenging that is, but you're also aware of how amazing it is, and you're trying to guide people towards it. And so it's a complicated thing. And you're aware of also how complicated all this is, and that it can't be, there's no simple solutions that you can just give to people that will solve all this. You're aware that this is a maturation process that it's tricky, it's challenging. There's so many traps. There's so many ways to go wrong. But on the other hand, it's so valuable. The strongest motivation for strategists is wanting to help others to evolve. Strategists oftentimes are people like humanists, developmental psychologists, coaches, consultants, thought leaders, and conscious executives. Strategists makes very good coaches. A lot of life coaches are at this stage. Business at the strategist stage now involves taking into account not just profits. It's not just about maximizing profits like it was for achievers. Now it's about taking into account tangible and intangible outcomes. So profits are still important, but also now intangible outcomes are important. The physical and mental health of the staff is important. The aesthetic work environment is important. Work-life balance is important, and serving the community is important, and serving mankind and the globe is important. The ecology is important. So all these complex factors now come into play when you're doing business, rather than just maximizing profits. See, if I ran Actualized.org purely to maximize profits, I would have hired a couple of marketing guys a long time ago. And Actualized.org, I could milk this for millions. I could milk it for millions. I'm not kidding you. But I just don't care to do that. Like it gives me no satisfaction. In fact, it would break my heart to do that to my own business, to run it in such a profiteering way. So I lose probably 80% of all the monetization potential of Actualized.org. I just literally throw it away. It's like burning money. Literally, I've probably burned a few $1 million in potential earnings over the last 5 years, simply because I just refuse to I refuse to sell merch. I refuse to do to run sponsorships or ads inside of the videos. There's ads at the start of the video, but those are just sort of like standard YouTube ads. I could really squeeze this thing if I wanted to, but I don't, because it's just my interest is not in that. I don't care about that. What I care about is developing myself and then helping others to develop and to understand the deepest aspects of reality. And to me, the money is just there. I mean, it's nice. Don't get me wrong. I'm not complaining about the money I earn. I earn decent money from my work. I'm quite satisfied with it. But sometimes I do wonder, man, what if I just go back to milking? What if I just go profiteering and milking? I could buy myself a much better house and drive a much better car and all this sort of stuff. Not that I couldn't. It's just I could buy myself a nice car today, but it's I don't want to. It gives me no satisfaction to do that. To me, driving a $20,000 car versus a $100,000 car adds nothing to my life. Nothing. It's a joke when I see people like, picking out expensive cars. It's a joke to me, because to me, it just looks like they're just wasting their life. Even the time you spend looking at fancy cars, to me, it's just a waste of life. But hey, that's just me. You might have a different point of view. Maybe you'll get there someday. Maybe someday you'll see it as I do, or maybe not. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with liking fast cars or something. I mean, you can like it. It's fine. You can have your hobbies and so forth. But also, stuff will fall away as you become more conscious and more developed. Strategists do have an attachment to others transforming themselves. I'm certainly guilty of that. You can be a little bit too attached to having others transform when they are not yet ready to transform. Not everyone is ready to transform. I had to sort of learn that the hard way. When I first started Actualized.org, I sort of was very aggressive with my, pushing others to transform. Nowadays, I'm a little more laid back. And if I see that a person is closed-minded or unwilling to understand something, if they're too argumentative, I'm not going to argue with them. I'm not going to try to open their mind. I'm just going to let them bask in their own ignorance. And then they'll either come around or maybe they won't. And that's not on me, that's on them. Where before I was placing that burden on me to change them. It's really not my job to change anybody. And so in this sense, I become more detached. But still, there's some attachments, of course, left. Developmental thinking is now an aspect of cognition for the strategist. Strategist takes into account how the self and others evolve. Strategists are convinced that higher development is always better and should be fostered at all costs. Sort of just what I talked about. That can be problematic if you take that too seriously. Yes, overall, we want people to develop, but we have to recognize that most people actually aren't ready to develop. Most people aren't ready for these videos. Most people aren't ready for spiral dynamics. Most people aren't ready for reading a 90-page, paper on ego development. Most people aren't ready for awakening or enlightenment. Most people are just barely struggling to maintain their job and to pay their bills. That's just where we're at developmentally as a species. Doesn't mean we have to stay there, but that's just kind of where we're at. For the strategist, every individual is now responsible for finding his or her unique style and actualizing themselves. Strategists are interested in psychological questions. They now recognize natural hierarchies, where before the pluralist didn't like hierarchies. The strategist understands that hierarchies do serve an important function. Some of them can be oppressive hierarchies, but other hierarchies can be healthy, necessary, and getting rid of them would actually lead to chaos and to dysfunction and to worse outcomes for all people. So we have to tune our hierarchies and, of course, get rid of the ones that are antiquated or oppressive. But a hierarchy is not inherently oppressive all the time. In this sense, Jordan Peterson does have a valid point. But again, he over-exaggerates it as well. The strategist believes that all human beings deserve respect, but not all are equally suited to doing a task, and not all opinions are equally valid. Some opinions are really bad opinions. Some opinions will lead to chaos and to disaster, and therefore they shouldn't be taken seriously. Some opinions are highly delusional and self-deceptive, whereas others are less so. And in this way, we can sort the good ones from the bad ones, understanding while we're doing that good and bad here is not objective, it's still relative, it's still perspectival, it's still not an absolute in any sense, but still, relative to the domain of survival, we can make some distinctions and evaluations as to what is workable, what is good, and what is bad. To the strategist, life is seen as an open-ended journey of never-ending growth and self-actualization. Strategists are very aware of self-bias, and they take it into account and they correct for it as much as they can, although that doesn't mean they're perfect. The strategist tends to find ordinary constraints of life stultifying, such as making a living and working an 8-hour workday. The strategist sees oneself as destined for greater tasks with far-reaching impact. Strategists are aware of the performative contradiction of postmodernism. What is that? The performative contradiction of postmodernism is this idea that all worldviews are subjective and that none should be privileged over any other. But then that itself becomes the privileged position, that you shouldn't privilege any other positions. But you're privileging your own position by saying other positions shouldn't be privileged. And so in this sense, you're creating, you're not being fully self-aware. And so the strategist is able to overcome that. This performative contradiction is a feature of pluralism that we discussed. There's an even greater increase of tolerance and appreciation of paradox at this stage. Strategists become very aware of how influences within systems are circular, cyclical, tapestry-like, and very counterintuitive. This is part of systems thinking. Go check out my episode called Intro to Systems Thinking for more about the counterintuitive and cyclical nature of systems. And the strategist is starting to understand circular causality and what I call strange loops, or what Douglas Hofstadter, to give him credit, calls strange loops. Go see my episode, Reality is a Strange Loop, for more on that. The strategist spends even less time and energy defending one's positions, which a lot of the lower stages waste a lot of energy doing. Inner processes become fascinating, complex, and demanding to explore for the strategist. The strategist needs a lot of privacy and time for self-reflection. Here, the self is constantly experienced as in transformation, and it's constantly being reappraised. So there's no static self anymore. The self is always growing, always transforming, and you're always wondering, like, well, what should the self become tomorrow or next year? And here, it's not about just acquiring more money. It's about how am I actually going to change my mental models? How am I going to change the way I interpret the world? How do I change the ways in which I relate to the world? It's sort of a meta. You're doing now personal development on a sort of a very abstract psychological meta level, rather than in the earlier stages where your personal development revolved around going to the gym and seeing how much you can bench press and, buying more expensive cars and, profiteering and squeezing more money out of your business. That's what self-development looked like at the achiever stage. The strategist takes responsibility for regulating one's thoughts, feelings, and behavior, even more so than the pluralist. The strategist holds that chances for self-actualization and self-fulfillment are essential for meaningful existence. There's deeper life purpose and legacy issues. Life purpose becomes central to the strategist. The strategist starts to acknowledge and re-own shadow parts of itself that it spent its whole entire lifetime denying. The strategist tries very hard to keep one's act together and to come across as reasonable, mature, and self-aware, to set a good example for others, to lead by example. The strategist tends to present oneself as an exemplar of humanity, giving off a whiff of superiority. I'm certainly guilty of that. I'm guilty of a lot of these strategist issues. Strategist has a very deep understanding of human nature, but it comes with the trap of self-inflation. You start to understand human nature so well that you become cocky, and you start to now get a sort of a false sense of understanding. You start to think, well, now I understand everything. Now I truly understand everything. Before I thought I understood everything, but now once I start to understand a little bit of self-bias and self-deception, I start to see it in me. I start to, integrate different shadow parts of myself and so on. Now I'm really actualized, you start to think. And you start to get a little cocky and arrogant about that. Of course, I'm very well aware that I do that. I'm working on reducing that. I think I've reduced it quite a bit in the last few years, but I still got more work to do for sure. So you guys aren't telling me anything new when you tell me that I'm being arrogant. I know that. I know that. Part of the reason I do it is just because I do it as a form of entertainment, self-entertainment. Hopefully it entertains you as well. Sometimes I do it just kind of tongue-in-cheek. Sometimes I'm so over-the-top arrogant that I'm hoping that you can see that I'm being like over the top arrogant without explicitly saying it. So that it's kind of like a joke. But also sometimes I truly am arrogant, so I know that. With the strategist, strong positive and negative feelings can both be acknowledged within oneself. So the previous stages tended to deny negative feelings as like bad stuff that we have to medicate our way out of or to escape from. Whereas now, the higher you go at this stage, you become just more mindful of the negative feelings, and you start to kind of aikido them, do sort of a jujitsu move on them where you take the negative feelings and you kind of find the positive in them, or you fully feel them, feel into them, and then that transforms their negativity, and it's sort of like a healthier coping strategy. Self and others are accepted as complex human beings with both positive and problematic traits and weaknesses. So nobody is good or bad. Nobody is satanic or demonic or evil. There's always trade-offs within personalities. People who are very strong in one thing tend to be weak in other areas. And that's just part of being human. And you have to accept that about yourself as well. You're not going to be this perfectly strong, perfectly well-rounded human as you imagine maybe in previous stages you could be. Here you start to accept that you're not going to be like that. It's always a never-ending process of slowly polishing yourself up, but you're always going to have some rough edges. The sort of idea that you will reach an end to self-actualization, this starts to go away. There's never an end. It's endless. One of the traps here for the strategist is identification as a transformer. You can identify as being this self-actualizing person, and that just becomes a new ego. So you have to be careful with that. Strategists can show impatience with slow development of others. I'm certainly guilty of that to a degree. There's a discovery at this stage of non-possessive love. That's a cool thing. There's an increase in benevolence and compassion towards oneself and others. There's a recognition of subtle distinctions in feelings and emotions. So you're really starting to make subtle distinctions now between different emotions and feelings that you have. You're able to feel into them and to distinguish them and to kind of understand the message that they're trying to communicate to you, rather than just being at the receiving end of them, rather than just being reactive against them, the way that most people are. Strategists tend to place high value on authenticity. Your life becomes all about becoming more and more authentic. How you walk, how you speak, how you relate to people, how you do business, how you make love, how you make money. It's all about making those things more authentic to your true self. The strategist makes use of dreams, fantasy, imagination, and vision much more so than previous stages. That's powerful. So your repertoire or your toolbox of what you can use to explore reality and your own self expands dramatically at these post-conventional stages. The strategist seeks solutions to large-scale and long-term problems that plague mankind. So it's not just about earning a profit for me. If I'm going to build a business, my business has to somehow fix large, long-term problems of mankind. Strategists seek sustainable solutions that address deep root causes. So we're not just interested in some little surface level fix. We want to go deep into the root of an issue and nip it at the bud, so to speak. Or at the root. Even better than the bud. Nip it at the root. The strategist is really able to think outside the box. The strategist stops using blaming as a defense in relationships. That's big. Notice how much you blame your girlfriend or boyfriend or spouse for all the stuff that goes wrong in your relationship. And then imagine living a kind of existence where you no longer blamed them for the things that go wrong. That's what starts to happen here. There's a deep concern for the well-being of future generations. A strategist is going to be thinking generationally into the future. It's not just about my own lifetime. It's about future generations of humans and how they're going to live and what's going to be good for them and what we need to build, what kind of infrastructure and systems we need to create for them. The strategist sacrifices oneself for the greater good. The strategist still has difficulty accepting what is. They're not fully enlightened, so to speak. They still struggle with difficult emotions and difficult problems in life that occur. Their spiritual goal at this point becomes to become enlightened. These strategists tend to be charismatic moral leaders who inspire others to follow their great vision of an ideal world order for future generations. Sort of exactly what I'm doing with Actualized.org. Strategists are able to forgive oneself, leaving behind guilt and harsh self-criticism. See my episode, How to Forgive Anyone Who's Ever Hurt You. And then you can also apply that to your own self as well, how to forgive yourself. Strategists tend to shift their humor to one that is non-hostile and more existential. Their humor becomes more lighthearted and directed at the folly of mankind rather than weaponized. The lower stages will weaponize humor against their enemies, whereas now, as a strategist, you realize I don't have any enemies, and so my humor just becomes about the human condition overall. That's still something I'm working on. That existential humor, got to work on that one. Sometimes I do still weaponize my humor, and I'm trying to let that go. Because you realize that using humor as a weapon is just another defense mechanism of the ego. The ego can lash out that way, can gain a sort of a upper hand, can make itself feel righteous by doing that. So that's something you have to unlearn. And you've probably spent decades learning that bad habit of weaponizing humor at the lower stages. The strategist is dissatisfied with life when he or she feels that he's failed to live up to his unique human promise and to one's own vision of being an actualized self and what one expects of oneself. That's definitely something that I've experienced a lot. Yeah, that's one of the greatest pains maybe of this stage, is that you know your potential so well, but then actually actualizing that potential is so challenging that it can become depressing or very frustrating because you're sort of constantly dissatisfied because you're trying to become more and more and more of yourself, but you realize it's endless. Where does it ever end? You can't just sit peacefully the way you can in some meditative pose, the way a yogi does at this stage yet. Strategists can face the problem that they feel like they've lost their sense of purpose after they retire because they're no longer needed, because they've invested a lot of their time and energy into coaching and mentoring others, helping others, guiding mankind. But then once you retire, you've lost all that. For a strategist, they're able to have realistic appraisals of situations unclouded by dogma and personal biases. That's one of the benefits of really understanding how bias works, self-bias. See my episode on self-bias, very important one. If you can really master understanding your own self-biases, the net result of that, why you want to do that, is that then you get an unclouded view of reality, which is quite nice. Unclouded by ego smog, as it's called. David Bohm called it ego smog, the cloud of ego smog. Strategists tend to become visionary leaders with the capacity to see how systems interrelate and their long-term implications. The chief anxiety at this stage is not to fulfill one's personal potential, not to self-actualize, failure to live up to one's universal principles, and a loss of courage because one's vision and one's projects are so ambitious. And in a sense, you're going against the grain of society, so it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of personal willpower and responsibility to live up and to actualize one's vision at this point. And lastly, the strategist uses differentiated psychological vocabulary. So very sophisticated psychological vocabulary when speaking about people, society, cultures, reality, spirituality, and so forth. And so there you go. That's the strategist. Now, that's it for part 2. Stay tuned. Next week, I will be releasing part 3, where we will be talking about the rarest 2 most advanced stages, the construct aware, and finally the unitive stage. This is really what we've been working up to. I mean, this episode we just did, for the majority of you, honestly, this is the stuff you got to work on right here. What I just talked about, these 2 stages, the pluralist and the strategist, if you can master these 2, you're going to experience a complete change in your reality. And then that's going to set you up for what we're going to be talking about in part 3. And if you can reach those stages, that's really where life becomes incredible. That's where you start to tap into something superhuman, something transhuman, which you couldn't even imagine was possible when you began this whole journey. But for the majority of you, what I just talked about, this part 2, keep rewatching it, keep studying it, read these sections in the paper from Susanne Cook-Greuter. Go actually print out that paper. Don't just download it as a PDF. You have to actually print it out, sit down with a highlighter, actually create like a 3-ring binder. When you print it out, hole punch it, create a 3-ring binder. That's what I did. Sit there, underline it, highlight it, take notes on every page of those 90 pages. Should be underlined to hell with notes in the margins and on the backs and fronts of these papers that you print out, and then keep studying it and keep rereading it every year as you're growing, and you will get more and more juice out of it, and it'll inform you and direct you into what you got to be working on yourself next. All right, that's it. I'm done here. Please click that like button for me right there. Don't forget, that helps me to get more views and to get this rare content out to more people, which is what we need. That's my mission, basically, with my work. And then come check out Actualized.org. There you will find exclusive content, stuff that I'm posting on my blog. You'll find exclusive videos on my blog. Don't miss those. Check out my book list. Check out my life purpose course. Life purpose course. I mean, that is huge. If you are a budding young pluralist or strategist, life purpose is going to become huge for you. You're going to need to find a way how to take your career and your work and the money that you're trying to make in order to pay your bills and to feed yourself, and the 8 hours every single day that you put into work, that needs to be something meaningful for you. That cannot be a factory job. That cannot be working at Starbucks. That cannot be one of these crap jobs. You got to take your gifts and talents and your high level of development and channel it towards the benefit of mankind in some way, which of course also pays you back some dividends too, so you can live a comfortable life. So my life purpose course is like 25 hours of exclusive content, new stuff that I haven't ever talked about on Actualized in the free content. In the course, you will get access to that in video form and in audio form, and with various exercises, very practical, that shows you the steps that I went through as a budding young strategist myself, maybe starting 10 years ago, to create this for myself. And it'll get you on track with that path. So check out the Life Purpose course, and I will be releasing courses in the future, so make sure you stay tuned for that as well. I have some courses that I've been planning to release now for a long time, but because of some health issues that I've been dealing with lately, that's sort of put some delays into the process. But I will be releasing new courses in the future that will be even better than the Life Purpose course, even more powerful, that will help you to develop up these higher stages. And you can also, if you'd like, support me on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/actualized and chip in $5 a month. That helps me to build a little nest egg of funding that I can use in the future for a little bit of advertising, or maybe hiring some people that can help me to take Actualized.org to the next level. All right, stay tuned for part 3. Do not miss part 3. This is the most important part of this whole series. So if you stayed with me for this long, you got to watch part 3. That's where it's all going.